There's this observation that I came across a while ago about how in cities, birdsong becomes higher pitched and it becomes quicker. And it makes me think about the reason that I call this free association is one, because free association, like that is the non-aggression principle, that is human rights. And it's also that there is something about extemporaneous speech that seems more natural. It seems more of a communication between minds than systematizing and writing something down. Now, that has a place, but I think that this is supposed to be an antidote to very planned and very conscious thought. Now, I'll talk about technology. And I suppose what a lot of people don't, when they think of technology, they think of electrified or mechanical things. They think of like computers, the cotton gin or something like that. But really, technology is anything that is you not squatting thoughtlessly in the dirt, basically. Like the minute that you have a thought, that you have an internal dialogue, that is technology. The minute that you speak, speech is technology. The minute that you grab a stick to like poke a grub out of the ground, that's technology. There's really no escaping it. And I think that anti-technology, or, Luddites and so on, they really only appear when the water boils fast enough that the frog is now aware that he's boiling. So technology did increase, at a relatively slow rate. But I mean, even back in the day, like when books started to come out, there was a hysteria about thinking that conversation and thought would become erased because people could just read it in a book. They thought that it would lose people's ability to actually speak. I remember this really old Lenny Bruce joke about how the Irish had the gift of gab because they had no written language. I guess more of an observation than a joke. I'm only half Irish, though. And so I think about this riddle, I suppose, about was the first word spoken a lie or truth? And human beings don't actually have alpha males. And actually the whole concept of alpha males is apparently not true. But when it comes to tribal and social animals, brute force is only one direction. It's only one tool, so to speak. And you can't really punch a skyscraper into existence. You can't really build by conquering. And so over time, we became more peaceful and collaborated because of language. And we developed all of these relationships. So monogamous relationships and families and tribes and governments, all technology. And they helped us achieve a lot of great things. The idea of cooperating instead of consuming one another. So slavery was quite inefficient and it stymied development, actually. Like one of the reasons the Roman Empire fell was because they relied far too much on slaves. Same with the southern United States. And, even back then there was all these arguments, I mean, at least with abolitionism in the States, that the textile industry would collapse and so the agricultural industry because we were so dependent on slavery that we just couldn't imagine a world without it. But when that collapsed, that is like the fact that it no longer takes 100 people to work a field. Now it's just one bored guy and a cell phone and some sort of massive farm machinery. That is a direct result of us recognizing human rights and then having to innovate the menial labor away by using technology. And every time that we recognize human rights more and more, the better we get. And when we're thinking about sort of systems of government and systems of morality, we tend to forget that those being technologies are also subject to advancement. But there's still an arms race between the shadow and the positive use of those technologies. So if we're talking about lies and we're talking about truth and we're talking about relationships that build rather than take down, when I'm talking about parenting, for instance, it is odd the feedback that I get from multiple people, and it tends to be a shade of kind of, I suppose if you're in a debate with somebody and they are going to black and white ideas and black and white defenses of things, that is an anxiety response. Fight or flight tends to cause a flattening of a subject matter. It tends to cause a sort of panicked response. And absolutes work in survival, but they don't work when you really have to do something. There is nuance that is necessary. And kind of the accusations that I'll get, and this is from multiple people, it'd be things like, well, you haven't considered your parents' context, or maybe you could have done something better to have them parent you better, or maybe you could have cooperated with the system better. Now, those are all fair points in a way. But the issue is that this is actually something of a family tradition. So my own parents have done sort of a post-mortem on their own childhoods and their own parents' experience. And to the degree that they could, they have learned from those mistakes. And they had become better parents, but they were limited by the world they lived in. So, when we talk about parenting and the instruction thereof, I think of like Lamaze classes and whatever. But I think that new parents, the first thing that they should know about is the Milgram experiment and the Stanford prison experiment. So the Milgram experiment being essentially if someone in a white coat, which represents authority, the zeitgeist, society, tells you to increase voltage on a shock that you're giving to somebody, even to the point of death, most people will just keep increasing the voltage. Okay, so people used to think that hitting your kids was just perfectly fine. And they used to think that screaming at them was perfectly fine because the society at large told them so. Stanford prison experiment was essentially absolute power corrupts absolutely, which is something that we've known from since antiquity, but we had it scientifically verified when you have sort of a mock prison. The prison guards will become very draconian and very cruel, even though they're ordinarily mild-mannered people. Every relationship has the risk of you becoming a tyrant and of you simply succumbing to groupthink about what that relationship ought to be. And if you actually love your parents, you hold them accountable. You actually engage in a dialogue with them because there is really no relationship that functions being one-sided. If you would say that you were in a marriage and your wife dictated everything or the husband dictated everything, and if you had a disagreement with them that you were ungrateful, or maybe you could give off a different energy, or maybe you're not considering their context, maybe you're not properly thinking about who they are as a person and what their wants and desires are. Well, no, because again, we're compartmentalizing everything into black and white boxes. Like, of course, my parents cared a lot about their parents' wants and desires and context of their life. They didn't view them as just flat tyrants. They knew that there was a context to it. And they proceeded the best they could based on that knowledge. And everything that I've said in these podcasts, I've actually said to my own parents, and an armistice was reached ages ago. And from that I learned that it is a matter of you confront sort of disordered parenting and dysfunctional parenting, not as a way to just punish people who are doing the best that they could, but to just teach yourself that even if it was understandable, it was still incorrect based upon a consistent set of ethics and morals and moral equivalencies and understanding of human nature. Because, as a child, like, you have your own context. And children are in a much worse position because not only do they have all the same pressures as an adult, but they also are in a state of mind that is a lot like being high 24/7. Anyone that can remember their childhood remembers it being just a long trip. So you're not really in a great place to begin with. So just everybody has their context, and all relationships involve a back and forth. And the whole point of the confrontation is to improve things, just as any technology improves. It's the same thing with government. I mean, so what I represent is libertarianism, market anarchism, anarcho-capitalism. And it's obviously an extreme viewpoint. And we get into that black and white thing where obviously people know something is wrong with government, but they can't quite articulate it. They can't quite face it. They're not really ready to have that conversation because a lot of people don't necessarily have the chutzpah to not be centrists, to not just go along with the crowd, because there are tremendous personal and financial incentives to be milquetoast, to be centrist, to not speak up. And if you have the ability to go into it with reckless abandonment, you should, which is what I'm trying to do here. But when a politician speaks about one thing being free market and spontaneous, and one thing being socialistic and capitalist and being communistic, frankly, the calculus of centrism is determined by the extremity. So whenever a politician talks about free markets and capitalism, they are talking about Mises and Rothbard and Hoppe. And although they've laundered it through Friedman, or they've laundered it through some modern neoclassical Chicago type thing that's taught at major universities with all the appropriate caveats to not raise too many alarm bells, they are speaking about anarcho-capitalism. Those principles that make freedom and markets the proper way to go and aligned with incentives and the reality of human beings and the way the world actually works, they don't disappear just because they're inconsistently applied. And it's the same thing where if someone talks about healthcare needing to be socialized, they are effectively referencing Marx and Engels and all these 17th century proto-socialists just without naming them. They've just had them laundered through more moderate milquetoast voices so as to not alarm anybody, to keep it nicely couched within the Overton window. So if you don't embrace extremity, and if you don't actually have a proper response to the extreme viewpoints, you will just forever be a tribute and a slave of the zeitgeist. That's just how it works. So if you want to be politically informed, you have to embrace and you have to be educated on the extreme, because everything that you do is determined by it one way or another. I mean, for God's sakes, Marx pawned his pants to pay his rent. But then he determined the course of the world in Europe and is responsible for millions upon millions of deaths just by his ideas. So ideas are very powerful and they need to be taken seriously. And I would say that this radical centrism that a lot of people engage in, that is you not taking ideas seriously, and they're coming for you. Simple as that. So, morality, ethics, government, these are all technologies that are subject to improvement and enhancement. And as I've said, there's a shadow to every technology. I mean, if we talk about cell phones, I mean, that's one of the major articles of technology where the water boiled a bit too fast and everyone's a zombie. And, I mean, I have a lot of friends in the press, so I'm not talking about you, but journalists are awful. The whole thing is just awful because news is meant to drive clicks, primarily. And history, in a lot of ways, is meant to drive clicks in that way. Like, history with the most compelling narrative tends to survive. History with the most convenient narrative tends to survive, usually in the hands of the victors. And so there's this thing about consuming information and, quote, being informed as a way to preempt getting taken advantage of. And none of that really matters because it is all about first principles. So any disaster or anything that the government does will have a certain structure to it. There's this idea about archetype being a technology in the sense that it allows you to compress information into something that is manageable and useful. And in fact, one could say that like biblical stories and things like Austrian economics and public choice theory are really very close to the same thing in structure, in the sense that they're this humble epistemic set of tools that allows you to view an almost infinite amount of information and compress it down into something that is actually useful. Because if you are broadly aware of the entire field of the world, I suppose it is a very sort of right hemispheric idea where you can just see the entire field. But a giant ocean of information is not useful. It does need to be put into some kind of architecture that allows you to navigate it. And history and news are kind of, they're actually too far into the right hemisphere direction, I feel, in the sense that it's too much context. And, when we talk about misinformation and malinformation and disinformation, the reason that the government is so fussy about this is because they know that they have, through public education and widespread gaslighting and violence and threats, have ruined people's ability to understand truth and have distanced people away from archetype. We've forgotten all the parables of the Bible. We've been disincentivized to learn Austrian economics and public choice theory because those are, quote, too reductionist and they're not useful enough. And all of the hottest experts don't use those economic models and those economic archetypes. I wouldn't even call them models. I'd really call them archetypal. But the point is that because we're so distant from the things that can actually help us make sense of reality, they're very concerned because they know that they have left the broad population completely open to believing whatever the hell the state wants them to believe. And it's the same thing with families that are overly restrictive. They need to limit information and they need to limit exposure because they know that the children have been weakened to a point where they'll basically just absorb anything and they won't be able to trust their own instincts. And they could go in a lot of different ways. It's the same thing with relationships too. If you're ever in a situation where you're keeping a friend or a partner away from information because you don't know what's going to happen with it, there's a very good chance that fear is based on the fact that you know that you have engaged in a very bad faith relationship. There's this idea, there's this rule almost that if truth has the ability to destroy something, it needs to be said. There's really no avoiding that. And so that is essentially how you handle information. Because I think a lot about this, about how we really had the same problem when we were toiling in the mud for 12 hours a day. And now when we have more information than a million lifetimes could actually deal with, there's this need to compress the actual truth of life into something that is palpable and something that is graspable, but is also aware of the greater environment that you're in and allows you to navigate it. It is a contradiction, and it is sort of like this field of experience. But the more that we distance ourselves from that, the worse it gets. So if we're talking about technology and cell phones and such, like you can sort of see that human beings are adaptable and they're survivors. That's what we do. We go to a new place and we survive. It's the Arctic, it's the desert, it's an island in the middle of nowhere. We find our way to work with it. And we've invented cell phones and we have these relationships and we have these structures. Well, there's a tremendous amount of hope in the fact that we are adaptable. So the mere fact that I'm even talking about a cell phone, I'm not just a slave to it. I'm not just some monkey that is, become obese because tourists keep feeding me and I can't stop. Because I have higher layers on top of that monkey brain, I can say, well, I'm spending too much time on my phone, and I can be metacognizant of what I'm doing with it. Am I reading news articles that have been algorithmically fed to me? Am I engaging with AI models that have been designed to have me utilize them as much as possible? Because a lot of those models do gas you up tremendously. Like, you got to do a lot of work to get those things to disagree with you. And there are cases of regular crazy people apparently succumbing to AI psychosis. Again, that's FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, thrown at AI because it's useful. Just as a sort of a tangent, but an important one, I think that a lot of the AI companies have overpromised their platforms to people. And they may be trying to point out, I feel like what they're trying to do is to say that it's not that we overpromised on all these enterprise solutions and all these consumer solutions. What's actually eating up a lot of server time and is making everything slow is schizos feeding their delusions, or it's people having relationships with artificial intelligence, the waifu phenomenon, so to speak. And I think that is intentionally put out there as a matter of propaganda, because they've like the amount of like I don't think the math really makes sense. Like it's $20 and $30 for like the pro versions of a lot of these services, and the amount of server time and just number crunching in the background is probably far more expensive than that. I've actually come across too, like people are really obsessed with water and AI. And I mean, I argue about it quite a lot on the internet, and it's being thrown at me quite a lot. Now, one thing to remember about the government and technology is that so the way that servers are cooled is through evaporative cooling. So a phase change of water actually takes a hell of a lot of energy. If you've noticed, like if you've ever seen like an electrical socket arcing out before, that's a lot of power behind those things. And yet to boil like a cup of water in a kettle using very, very efficient methods of heat, it still takes a long time to phase change water into boiling or into steam. And so the most efficient way is to like take potable water and boil it off into the atmosphere to cool these servers. And the reason that they have to use fresh water is because these systems cannot have biofouling, which is if you have dirty water, causes like a lot of bacterial growth, and you can't have it can't be too acidic or it'll corrode a lot of the pipes. So basically you need to have potable treated water that is suitable for human use, just being boiled off into the atmosphere. And when we're talking about this Faustian bargain between can people drink or can AI servers exist, well, the problem is that the state has a monopoly on water. And so it arbitrarily sets the price of water. We don't really know how much water actually costs. And I know the world is full of water and the world is full of a lot of fresh water, but treated water, treated and tested water that is pumped to your house, that is actually a very, very, very finite good. And when it's subject to basically communistic control, you run into the issue where because there's no competition, you don't know how much a given unit of water should cost. You just sort of arbitrarily fix the price. And it makes no sense. And what'll happen is that the AI facility, because it would be ungodly to charge money for water, this is like a pure thing where it's just like, well, no, that's you can't commoditize water. That's regressive. That's neoliberalism gone mad. Well, no, because we don't really know. Like if an AI company actually had to pay to treat its own water, maybe that subscription where you can talk to your AI girlfriend 24/7, maybe that subscription would cost you $100. Maybe it would cost you $300. And then people's consumption, they would naturally tend to lower their consumption as the price got too high. That is how markets prevent scarcity. But when you get the government coming in and basically discounting the price of water to an AI server farm, you end up creating a negative externality for everybody else, where there's water shortages. If there's a shortage of something, that means the price is typically too low. And we don't really even know if the price of water is being artificially depressed or increased, because without market signals, we've got no idea about that. And so when we talk about technology advancing and we talk about the technology of government advancing, this is one of those things where we have to embrace the extreme and actually subject water to market forces so we can figure this out, so that we don't have to go into all of these, frankly, Pyrrhic and pointless regulatory battles. Because I'm not sure if you've noticed, but large corporations tend to have a lot more leverage in this dumbocracy, as I call it, than the average person. It's been happening for hundreds of years, and you would think people would learn the lesson by now, but because everybody needs to be a fucking centrist, we're never going to have that discussion. And when I say pay for, I mean pay a fair market price, not one that is determined by a politically expedient model or a politically popular model, or one that is based on some sort of fantasy model that the bureaucrats have come up with. People are going to shirk away from like, oh my God, we can't charge money for water. We can't have anybody but the government control water. Because again, the AI companies, even if they wanted to pay for their own water, they couldn't because all the infrastructure is state-owned. And that would be literally the worst thing to ever happen to human society if somebody actually set up their own water treatment architecture concurrent and parallel to our own. It's the same thing with power lines and power distribution. It's a government monopoly. We don't know how much it costs. We know how much it costs as much as the Soviets knew how many cars versus roofing nails versus tractors to make out of steel. It's untenable, and it is one of these great walls that is holding us back from actually advancing. It's the same thing too with nuclear power. Now, it's interesting that, like in Alberta, and I suppose this is true for my listeners in Texas or Dubai or whatever, is that in a way it is actually smart for a government or a territory, if they're under an oppressive state, to really focus on having a resource that cannot be moved and making that the basis of your economy. So if Alberta had really allowed like steel mills and industrialization and car factories and whatever to happen in this province, well, in the 1980s, NAFTA would come through and decimate it. Foreign cars would decimate it. And you would end up like Detroit, or you would end up, well, like the whole Rust Belt in the United States when steel manufacturing moved overseas to the Asian tiger economies. But by relying on oil, the thing that can't be exported, you can't take all of our oil and bring it down to Mexico. You can in the refinement, but not the actual extraction of the stuff. However, we're being rapidly outpaced by other economies. And we also have not developed any nuclear infrastructure. So we're reaching the point now where we can't actually produce enough power to be competitive with these AI server farms to foreign countries, because we had spent all this time suppressing nuclear power and the development thereof in North America. Now, the first thing is that we've got Chernobyl. And the reason that we cannot get over Chernobyl is because we love socialism. North American politicians love socialism, so they can never really fully denounce the Soviet Union. They can only say that it was misapplied, or if it was slightly modified, it would have done the job, because our politicians are a lot more like Soviet commissars than anybody wants to admit. And so they can never say that Chernobyl was a failure of socialism. It was a failure of government control. They can't say that. So they have to indict nuclear technology as such as a dangerous technology. There's also this admission, and this is frankly possibly subconscious, but politicians know how corrupt the government is, and how nepotistic, and how inefficient and dangerous things can get when you have a government monopoly on something. Because these aren't independent companies that will be building these reactors. These are governments. These are government jobs. And incompetence in certain infrastructure, they can just do the whole mistakes were made and, we've taken lessons from this, and like just the regular hoser politician thing where they, admit to things that would land you in prison for hundreds of years in concurrent sentences. They can just say, well, mistakes were made. Okay, so if a reactor goes critical, there's no papering over. That's a lot of people with really cushy jobs that will be absolutely destroyed, and there's no covering it up. And so I think a lot of times they don't want more nuclear facilities because it's too dangerous and it's too much responsibility for this class of aristocrats to actually engage in. And so the people that will have nuclear power plants are the ones that just don't care, who will just say, well, we need nuclear power, doesn't matter what we have to do to make it happen. And if we don't have any of that kind of spirit, while having it completely communistic, it's going to go to China. It's not going to go to the US. It's not going to go to Canada. It's not going to go to Alberta. And there's also this horrible thing that it takes 20 to 50 years to actually get a reactor online. It's not, you can't just build it like a shopping mall. It's a big bloody thing. And the human capital necessary, like nuclear physicists and engineers, these are very specialized trades, very specialized individuals that go like that actually run these things. And it'll take decades for how slow we are and how everything has to be committee after committee after committee. It's not looking great. So you would have to have marketized nuclear power plants. Private investors, pricing incentives. And the thing is, like, if you actually caused another Chernobyl, what's interesting is that Chernobyl itself caused trillions of dollars in damage, but no one was really held accountable to it. If it was a marketized system, but we had a functioning system of law, if you cause a meltdown, people will actually hang for that. People will actually pay for that. And there's not going to be a bunch of cover-ups because private entities cannot just cover things up unless they own the government or, frankly, they are the government. So this general malaise about nuclear power, like, I understand where it comes from, and it was actually relatively smart because really it's an existential threat to these resource-based economies to diversify, believe it or not. But now things have changed, but there's too much inertia. And so we're probably going to lose out in a lot of ways unless everybody embraces these extreme positions. There's something about, I've often had this idea about the idiot janitor dichotomy. And it's just this idea that the people that actually do things do so with something of a reckless abandonment. Like they're idiotic about it. Like, you have to take risks, and to do that on a countrywide scale, yeah, you're going to have to cause a lot of disruption, and you're going to have to get over a lot of foot dragging, but you just have to do it. And we'll figure it out when we get there. That's where the janitors come in. I just think of small business owners where, like, I mean, this is no one specifically. This is a kind of a combination of them. But like a guy that owns a mid-level trucking company, so he has like 10 kids with like 3 different women. He comes in to his accountant's office with a garbage bag full of business receipts. And he's like, well, I'm off to Cancun, tax time. And he tosses a garbage bag full of receipts on his accountant's desk. It takes all sorts of people. And we need less accountants. We need more 8 children with a garbage bag full of receipts kind of energy in this country, in this world. Like there is no more safe centrism. We have to get a little nuts if we want to actually do something technologically. And we are in a good place too, because if you want to talk about cooling, I mean, you would generally want to go as north as possible. And you would generally want to go in the place that has the highest freshwater reserves. So I'm thinking Alberta is probably the best place to do this. If, for the love of God, we can stop fighting with each other about how to become free and independent. I can't stress this enough. This economy of ego and this economy of purity tests and this economy of just, I mean, it's sometimes hard to know who your friends and enemies are because the friends seem to treat you worse. And I'll leave it at that. And, the last thing on the nuclear thing is I'll just say that this idea about nuclear weapons and how a fission bomb is always associated with nuclear power. And it's really funny because as terrifying as nuclear weapons are and how they have the potential to annihilate the world, they really have saved more lives than you could ever possibly imagine. Because governments fucking love war. They love the shit out of war. They will get into them anytime that they can. A politician is supported unanimously almost during times of war. They can mobilize and they can ignore laws and they can ignore decency and they can draft teenagers and they can become very powerful and stay that way for life. It is a politician's dream to have a war. And I love the fact that a bunch of metal cans sitting in silos are preventing all of those warmongers from actually having large campaigns. The best that they can do is build a bunch of tanks and planes that are never going to be used anywhere. Like I don't really want to go too much into like this kind of Tom Clancy like warfare nerd thing, but like I can't stress how ridiculous it is to build a tank in 2025. To what? Fight open warfare in the fields of Europe? No, because those wars will be turned into glass. Those fields will be turned to glass before a tank actually rolls its treads anywhere past those borders. Like, you can have skirmishes. Like, we've had these small proxy wars ever since the invention of the bomb, but they haven't been anywhere near the scale of the world wars. There would have been a World War III if Oppenheimer and Einstein and I'm sure and Feynman didn't do their work back in the day. So I understand that it's like super scary, and I know that everyone's seen the film reels of like a house collapsing and like kids hiding under their desks and whatever. But perspective is very, very necessary here. World wars kill tens of millions of people as a baseline. Okay, a limited nuclear exchange will not cause that many deaths, and it's probably not going to happen in the first place. It's just the incentives, like, you're always in a checkmate situation. There is no way for one of those to go off. And even if somebody launched one, the consequences of actually retaliating are so high that it would never happen. You could actually just fire one off, and then there would be hesitation from either side because people are like, okay, we have to wait and see what happens. So it's not going to happen. And the idea of like denuclearizing, I mean, that makes sense in a way because you don't need a lot of them. This thing about having like thousands of warheads per side, that is basically pork barrel spending. You don't need that many. And I'm sure nobody's really talked about this for decades, but you really don't need that many. And when we're talking about technology and the effect on relationships and so on, there's obviously this thing about dating apps, which, you know, I've been asked to speak more about relationships and intimacy, and it's tricky because in a lot of ways, like, I'm always tempted to be very humorous about it. And I think that is because it's such a serious and life-altering thing that, you know, humans just have this reaction to like hilarity, which is something that is so overwhelming that you go insane. That is the original definition of hilarious. And you can either weep or you can laugh. Those are the reactions to overwhelm. And I suppose if you're not prone to weep about it, you're prone to laugh about it, which is why you make so many jokes about it. There's also the fact, too, that, I mean, the person that suggested this is married. And I'm like, well, what do you want to hear me talk about intimacy about? Like, so I can tell everyone to have a long-term relationship that ends with a soft landing? Like, is that what people are really listening for? The most that I can offer, I suppose, is just in the talk of technology. Like, you know, this fella met his wife on a dating app, which is incredibly rare. If you look at the charts of what actually happens, you'll go on 10,000 dates or whatever, and like the marriage rate is like 0.001%. And I've heard of all of these stories too of people saying that, like, I'm so glad that I met my wife right before Tinder dropped because the marriage rate among their friends group just plummeted precipitously. Because there is this thing about dating just endlessly as a sort of proxy activity versus just, it's not even really settling down. It's just having the attention long enough with a single person to actually develop a relationship with them, which is difficult. If you're choosing between 100 people, you get decision fatigue. And it's much in the same way that, so like if we're talking about how archetype is a good way to crush down a lot of disparate information and very wide fields of information. Well, so dating sites, I suppose, would be considered like a very kind of left hemispheric, a very almost like an econometric, you know, sort of Keynesian model of the love economy, so to speak. You know, there's this idea about people matching based on hobbies and algorithms that it seems to make sense prima facie, but it really doesn't. I mean, I had very good advice when I was growing up because, you know, when I was 17, I mean, my parents didn't really have much advice because my parents got married fairly young and they're from a different time. And it's not like I would ever imagine asking them any of the nitty gritty about it. And then, of course, you've got sex ed in school, which was just, you know, look left, now look right, now look at yourself. All of you will get AIDS unless you do exactly as we say in this teacher's guide. Never mind, here's a Zapruder-esque 8mm film of an iodine-drenched woman giving birth. Yikes. It's just, we've got the best I can say is a spiritual gap in the way that we handle these things. And there is not a lot of decent prep for what is actually to come, so to speak. And so I would talk to all of these like 50-year-olds, men and women actually, and just all these snippets of advice, like, oh, your girlfriend is really messed up during PMS. She is going to be terrifying when she's pregnant. Or people telling me about how they grew up in places where you weren't allowed to buy condoms without a marriage license, so they had to use candy bar wrappers. And they would talk about losing your virginity, kind of like, where like you hardly remember anything, and you're in a lot worse shape than you thought. Like you're approaching this moment of mutuality, and your calves start to give out, and just. And so there was sort of like body kind of wise advice, but then there were things like, it's not that she has to have the same hobbies as you. It's just that she has to care about something as much as you do in the certain ways that you do. Like hobbies cannot just be consumptive. They have to be edifying. They have to be giving growth to something. It's more about the depth than it is the actual simpatico of things. Another piece of advice was like, don't sleep with anyone that you would never consider marrying. And I've kept to that one for quite a while. I mean, as best as one can. These rules are not perfect. And I just remember my own experience on dating websites. And I mean, I gave up on them pretty quick. Just because, I'm very critical. Like I've never really gotten a job by looking at a public listing for a position. Because there is something about in-person contact, like the boomer handshake or like getting in on a connection. Like the thing is like, it is sort of like the Stanford prison experiment, where it's just like you become really high on your own supply as a hiring manager, where you just like, here are all these thousands of very specific things. You should have 8 years on QuickBooks, and you need to be like an expert and a wizard and all these things. And just like this laundry list. And I'm just like, if you have an above average IQ, you can basically do any office job. Like you don't need a decade in QuickBooks. You can learn that in an afternoon. Like get a dummies book. Like nothing is so hard and complicated. Just make sure the person is not a psychopath. Make sure that they're moderately reliable, they're well rested, they're kind of healthy, and then that's it. You don't have to like just this commodification of people is insane, and it is not really helping anything. Again, the HR hiring managers, they look at thousands and thousands of applicants, where you could just solve that in an afternoon by just talking to a candidate, just headhunting somebody. I really hesitate to work for a company that does not hire based on personal recommendations and relationships. And it's the same thing with dating. It's people that you meet in the world, people that you actually have conversations with. This idea of algorithmic matching and sort of swiping on like this most idealized photograph of somebody is also crazy. Like when you meet somebody in person, you see them in multiple lights, multiple bad lights. You see them interacting with people. You see them interacting with the room. You see how they talk, how they laugh, how they look at you. Those are all like you smell their pheromones. And that's actually a very important thing. Pheromonic transmission, like I don't wear cologne. This is because this is a bit of a psycho thing, but there is a basis to it. In pheromones, there is information exchanged about immune system capability. You're attracted to people whose immune systems are complementary to yours. The idea being that the offspring have more diverse immune system responses. It's crazy. And I know that Brett Weinstein, and Heather Haying, the Dark Horse podcast, they are talking like when people, they're evolutionary biologists, and when people suggest that there's no pheromonic transmission between people, they really call bullshit on it, which I'm happy for. But anyway, so it's just the people that I met on the dating websites. I mean, first of all, I think smart people are going to be psychos in their 20s anyway. There's kind of no avoiding it. I mean, there was a story I heard about Conan O'Brien where he said there's actually footage of him falling in love with his wife that you can watch. And this, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but what it was he was going, the bit was they got some guy from like small town Texas or something that was advertising his furniture store. And it was like a really corny commercial. And the joke was is that they bring this guy out to a New York City ad agency and they let the ad agency work on it. And so his wife, or future wife, was one of the copywriters. And there's this moment where she said, like, XY is emblematic of what you're trying to go for. And you can kind of see that look of recognition in his eyes. And I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but he said, like, apparently it's like, you had me at emblematic. And so I remember this woman that I went on a date with, and we were walking around, and I remember that she was on a swing set, and we were talking about something, and then she said, that's very good inductive logic, Raymond. And I was like, but that was a moment where I was like, wait, how do you know what inductive logic is? You should know what that means. I mean, I was obviously a bit of a pretentious shithead, but I mean, she was a very smart, well-read woman. Just a very classic, just a very classic combination. Like, she was very much like a stack of books and tea kind of girl. She was like 15 pounds overweight in just the right way. A lot of novels. She like lived with her aunt, and just this perfect combination of things. Like, there was a moment where I thought, this is it. And, I met her on a dating site, and I just remember, like, it was a series of dates. And I should point out, like, I didn't judge anybody too harshly. Like, I was just there for the experience. And I thought, wow, this is it. And so at some point she said, my grandmother said I should never date somebody with 3 first names. And I was just like, what does that mean? What does that mean? Even to this day, I'm like, what the hell did that mean? But anyway, so a couple of dates, and then she ends up in my apartment, which I was renting this from a terrible, insane person. Like, I think that she was legitimately bipolar. And she had hot flashes all the time. And so she would keep the house at 18 degrees for her, but because I was in a basement that had like literally this like manly iron mask, like breadboard sized window with cages on it, it's super illegal. But in my apartment, in my room, it was like 14 degrees. And so she goes down there and she can almost like see her breath in the air. And there's a woman in my bedroom on my bed, and she takes a nap. And I let her. I mean, what is one to do? So she leaves, and she ghosts me. And this was in like January. And then she texts me on Valentine's Day when she's in class. And she's like, hey, how's it going? And I, again, being a 20-year-old psychopath, is like, what the fuck are you doing? You haven't spoken to me for 2 weeks. Why are you texting me out of the blue? Like, how dare you? What is this? You don't talk to me for all this time? Like, you take a nap and you leave? And then, like, what in God's name is going on here? And, I realized that, I mean, and it's kind of sad, too, because, like, I maybe 2 years later, she got married and then divorced a year later. And obviously, I win. No, but I mean, nobody wins. But it's just this realization that, like, no, this is unnatural. There's something that doesn't work about this. Like, the fact that either of us are on a dating site is an indication that the real world has rejected us. There's something that, like, either we're avoiding necessary confrontations, like we're not going to parties. We're sitting in our houses on our computer in our underpants. Like, we're not going out there and actually dealing with like these living, moving people in the world. We're engaging with these flattened avatars of one another. And, for her, like, it's obviously some kind of issue of intimacy. And, I was kind of nuts myself. I mean, I can joke about a lot of the people that I met, but at the same time, like, what would they say about me? It's just like, I don't know, like, he went on this like 15-minute rant about how like socialized medicine is terrible and how it's just going to get worse over time. And like, he just wouldn't stop. It's like, well, I don't know, what'd you say? I just said my mom was a nurse. And that is a real story. Like, again, like, I was not ready for prime time at that point. I was not, like, there's a certain chaos that had to be tamed, but it should have been tamed in the real world. And like, I mean, I met like, there was one woman that I met, and we went on a date, and, when I talk about the family and I talk about all of these experiences and so on, it's because I've talked to people. And one of the first times that I remember this was we spent God, like an hour or two sitting in like the crook of a tree talking about her parents and their divorce and like what it did to her. And I remember she would sometimes speak of herself in the third person in messages, like so-and-so, oh, can't go out tonight. So-and-so has a Mario Kart like fest or something. Like, she was a very like kind of Quirk Chungus type. But again, it's just like, she was on a dating site, I was on a dating site. We were both on the Indeed. Like, where was the personal, where was the internal hiring there? Where was the recommendations? Or I always went for the smartest person possible. So like, there was this woman that had like a literary scholarship. Like, she was a really big deal. And she said that she could never make out with anybody because the scent of human saliva disgusted her. So it was just kind of like right to sex. I mean, not with me, but I mean, just in general. And then there was one, like, it was just like a date or two. And, just like to get to know her. I don't do that weird thing where I'm like, okay, third date, you have to kiss. So it was just like a date or two. Nothing happened physically. And it's important to mention because, later on I said, hey, I never heard back from you. What's going on? And she says, like, honestly, I'm dating like 15 people right now. And that was my first acquaintance with this decision fatigue that people develop when they go crazy with online dating. And, I know that it's not like a huge transmission route. Like, I got strep throat when I was a teenager, and I was like, I'm kind of, I don't really like make out with strangers, so to speak. And so I'm especially glad in this circumstance, but also just the fact, like, 15 people, that's 14 more people than you should be dating at a time. I don't think that people should be double teaming. There's something that's not really, I think that you should be able to choose well enough in the first place to not have to be in like this group situation. It turned me off from it very quickly. I mean, in fact, geez, like, on the opposite side of that, like, coworkers. If you deny the possibility of finding a lifelong love by avoiding dating coworkers, please, for the love of God, do not let your life be dictated by HR policies. Just fucking do it. It's fine. Nobody cares. It's a job. Really, it does not matter even slightly, because, one of the lucky things about, well, actually, no, because back in the day, people would meet their wives at work all the time. You would just sort of pick out a girl from the typing pool. This modern, like, overly litigious thing, like, if you know, and don't be crazy about it. I mean, it's almost sort of like how people used to drink at work and it was fine. But a couple of people took it way too far and they had to go nuts, and it ruined it for everybody. I suppose that's some of my wise advice. And yes, so, the people that actually met spouses on these dating sites, they recognize it as a miracle, and for precisely those reasons. And true, like, I don't want to tell his story for him, but it was a situation where, like, it was just like a regular Tinder-y thing, but there was just a moment where he's like, oh, I'm going to spend my life with this woman. Like, it is very much like that, where you just seemingly have a moment where you're like, oh, Jesus, this is something. But again, I won't tell this story for him, but it's, it's a good one. It's an important one. And so even now, though, the fact that we can speak so candidly about how gross and inhuman dating sites are, and like how long have we really been destroying ourselves with them? Like, I don't know, 10 years, 5 years, whatever. It's like the world is healing after this experience. And every time that we abuse technology, we learn something from it. Like, we know the mistake not to make. And if you think about it, like, so the communication protocols that have allowed all this to happen, dating websites included, if you're actually in love with somebody and actually in a relationship with somebody, well, now you have the ability to contact them and to use technology to become closer together. It's all about the attention that you pay, all the ways that you use it. And so I'm actually quite enthusiastic about technology. And I think that the because I've spoken about Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, before. And, it's with him, it's tricky because he was not just a crazy guy. Like, it wasn't a chaotic insanity. It was really like he was the canary in the coal mine, where he was a very smart guy that thought very, very, very deeply about everything, which is a good quality that everyone, or at least some segment of the population, needs to have. But technology drove him insane. I mean, there's so many things to think about, and so many things that he lost grasp of. I mean, he portended the sort of milder insanity that we experienced later on, because people are not committing murder because of it, but we're becoming angrier and we're becoming shorter with each other, and we are distancing ourselves with technology. We're playing video when we should be out in the world. We're listening to podcasts instead of actually talking to people. Ironically, you're listening to this podcast, but I mean, there is something about free associative thought, extemporaneous conversation, that is valuable. And this is a good way to communicate conscious things to one another. There is value to having more structured podcasts, more architecture to it, but I think that there is a very good place for long form content like this as an antidote to, I suppose, content that is trying to draw you in. I mean, a lot of this is not me. I tend to avoid sensationalism, and I tend to avoid doomer narratives. I mean, I really do maintain that there's tremendous reasons to be optimistic, but you have to be careful about it. That things are very hopeful. I mean, I have a friend or two that just sends me voicemails every so often, which is just like, man, like, everything seems to suck out there, but like, I'm walking around the neighborhood today and I'm seeing like kids out playing, and I'm seeing people barbecuing, and I'm seeing people flying kites, and I'm just like, man, everything's going to be okay. And that is, I suppose that's not driving a lot of clicks, and probably not driving a lot of donations and so on, but this is what reality is. And I would say that the default for reality is optimistic and hopeful.